hablar de ese pueblo de Chile, que quieren este país donde a la gente le vaya bien, que se crean entre los cubanos en el exterior
Hola amigos, hola amigas de Conversaciones Americanas, qué gusto estar hoy de nuevo con ustedes. Hoy hicimos un programa temprano en el que entrevistamos a la escritora Uva de Aragón en torno a su última novela y tenemos la posibilidad de salir de nuevo porque hemos hecho también una entrevista a propósito de la desclasificación de documentos relacionados con la administración, el gobierno de John Fitzgerald Kennedy, la administración Kennedy, y estamos ahora saliendo de nuevo para compartirles una muy interesante entrevista que hicimos a el analista y profesor asociado a los archivos de seguridad nacional de la Universidad George Washington, Peter Kornbluh. Peter Kornbluh es un importante académico que además es el autor de varios libros como Pinochet desclasificado, donde él tiene varios de los documentos muy importantes que marcan la relación de Estados Unidos con Chile en el proceso de la caída del gobierno de Allende y después. Y también es el coautor con William Leogrande del libro Diplomacia Encubierta con Cuba o Back Channel a Cuba. Yo quería hablar algunas cosas porque ya que he salido, mi propósito era poner directa la grabación, pero ha sido difícil y verán por qué y voy a mencionarle algunos elementos. El primero, entonces, voy a hablar por un periodo breve y voy a poner la entrevista directamente. Primero, quiero reportar sobre esta noticia que nos pone una persona que se hace llamar un cubano más, que nos dice que si seríamos tan amables de tener una mención para Giovanni Oliva, el que se asociaba al nombre de Lo que pique el pollo, quien dice que falleció hace unas horas. Bueno, yo he tratado de llamar, parece que esto es cierto, yo siempre soy muy escéptico con las redes porque a veces tratan de decirle a uno cosas y que uno las crea y no, pero yo he conversado con un par de personas que lo conocían y me confirman que parece que esto es así, por lo cual voy a hablar de su caso. Yo lamento mucho y quiero transmitirle mis condolencias a la familia, a la esposa, a los amigos de familiares de Giovanni Oliva por esta triste noticia. Yo lo recuerdo con una buena onda. Oliva por un tiempo incluso habló y criticó posiciones que yo tenía en este programa, lo cual a mí no me molesta en lo absoluto, pero lo hizo con respeto, se concentró en los argumentos y por ese motivo lo invité a venir. Él vino al chat, participó haciendo preguntas, participó haciendo comentarios y en determinado momento incluso estábamos haciendo un programa sobre la lucha de líderes afroamericanos por los derechos civiles, hombres y mujeres gloriosas de ese gran contingente de la población norteamericana que son los afro-norteamericanos, y viendo que él sabía mucho, lo invité a subir y al final hicimos el programa juntos sobre un libro sobre Malcolm X y Martin Luther King. Esto no dejó nunca en ese sentido de ser crítico, un crítico desde una izquierda más a lo radical, aun cuando después supe que él había iniciado sus posiciones políticas en el movimiento de Orlando Gutiérrez Boronat, pero muy decepcionado, decía él, por la corrupción, por las cosas que andaban mal, por la falta de principios en esa parte del exilio cubano. Terminó por salir de ahí, exploró sus propios caminos, estudió por sí mismo y tomó posiciones de izquierda radical que en ocasiones lo llevaron a ser crítico con posiciones que yo tengo y que yo acepto y discutí con él y conversamos. Le agradecí mucho que subiese, enriqueció el programa. Vamos a ver si la próxima vez que yo hable de este tema, la persona que se identifica un cubano más puedo recordar el programa y poner un fragmento, porque creo que Oliva se lo merece. Así que mis condolencias a su esposa, familiares, amigos, etc. Este programa, vamos ahora a hablar del programa que voy a poner ahora. Este programa estuvo motivado por, y mi contacto a Peter Kornbluh estuvo motivado porque dos cosas han ocurrido recientemente, de las cuales yo quiero volver a tratar ya desde mi propia perspectiva, no de la conversación con el académico Peter Kornbluh. El primero fue la desclasificación masiva de documentos o de información, porque muchas veces lo que se trató fue de eliminar tachaduras que se habían hecho como parte de la desclasificación de documentos en torno a una ley que salió a principios de los 90, que se conoce como la ley de JFK y que fue motivada a crear un calendario de declasificación total de los documentos. Esto fue durante la administración Clinton que se pasó esta ley, una declasificación total de la información en torno a el asesinato terrible del presidente John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Yo creo que si algo muy fuerte que ha ocurrido y eliminó, o no eliminó, pero sacudió el alto nivel de confianza que tenía el público norteamericano, o fue un periodo que se inicia con esto, que sacudió el alto nivel de confianza que tenía el público norteamericano, la sociedad norteamericana y el gobierno. Primero fue el asesinato de JFK, de John Fitzgerald Kennedy, una figura muy, muy interesante en la historia norteamericana, y después algo que yo considero fatídico por múltiples razones, me refiero a el asesinato en 1968 de su hermano, el ex fiscal general Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy. No era Fitzgerald, es RFK. Y también el asesinato de Martin Luther King en 1968. Yo creo que dos grandes líderes también se fueron allí, y cuando uno ve el equipo que se empezó a nuclear en torno a RFK de Robert Kennedy, yo creo que es muy difícil decir que el curso de la historia, las posibilidades de un encaminamiento distinto de Estados Unidos, en mi opinión, para bien, no se frustraron con esto. Yo creo que ese es un elemento importante, esa desclasificación a partir de un calendario que establece esta ley. Y yo creo también, como vamos a ver en la entrevista, la presión que significa el ascenso a partir de una alianza con el presidente Trump, entonces el candidato Trump, del hijo de Robert Kennedy, que es Robert Kennedy Jr., ambos con posiciones en el tema de Cuba y hacia América Latina, primero su padre y después él, mucho más abierta que las que tiene la administración Trump, por supuesto, y de otras administraciones que la han precedido, incluyendo la administración Biden, hay que decirlo así. Y esa desclasificación fue parte de la motivación para este programa y contactar al profesor Kornbluh. Y el otro elemento es una audiencia que tuvo lugar en el Congreso de Estados Unidos, particularmente en la Cámara de Representantes, en el comité que dirige la republicana por Florida, Ana Paula Luna, y fue una audiencia muy, muy interesante con presentaciones de varias personas, incluyendo el cineasta Oliver Stone, el autor de la película, el director de la película, que motivó la gran presión. Recuérdese que a principios de los 90, después de que la película fue puesta, una película muy controversial, pero un número muy grande de norteamericanos más de la mitad de los estadounidenses no expresaron no creer la conclusión del informe de la comisión Warren. Se llama Warren porque era dirigida por el jefe de la Corte Suprema, el juez máximo, el juez jefe de la Corte Suprema, Errol Warren, que también es una figura histórica en los Estados Unidos por casos que la Corte decide de manera unánime en torno a los derechos civiles, el caso Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka y el importante caso para los mexicanos americanos y los latinos en general, bajo la doctrina de una clase aparte que se llama Hernández versus Texas. Yo creo que esto es importante que se conozca el nivel de escepticismo, suspicacia en el público norteamericano en torno a esto. A la vez es importante mirar que las teorías conspirativas son solo eso hasta tanto no puedan probarse. Y esto es algo que ustedes van a notar que en el diálogo con el profesor Kornbluh, él es muy suspicaz ante las teorías conspirativas. Las conspiraciones no son en general la explicación de la política, pero hay que recordar que de vez en cuando sí ocurren y entonces confirman, alientan, alimentan ese tipo de posiciones y particularmente en la audiencia, en el comité de Ana Paula Luna, eso fue dominante. Estuvieron varios autores, yo quiero destacar el caso del director de cine Oliver Stone y el caso de Jefferson Morley, y hubo 2 o 3 más, y además se discutió el tema de la defensa, la importancia de defender la privacidad de los ciudadanos en procesos de desclasificación. O sea, en algún momento yo quiero traer de nuevo esto de la audiencia y presentarlo aquí. Nótese que aunque el profesor Kornbluh es muy escéptico en torno a esas teorías conspirativas, él en su artículo en la revista The Nation, que es una revista muy importante que dirige Karina van der Hoeven y que expresa en ese artículo Kornbluh que le agradece paradójicamente a Oliver Stone la presión que hizo para que se desclasificaran muchos más documentos. Hay que decir que hubo una presión no solo porque se desclasificara en estrecho lo que tenía que ver con el asesinato del presidente Kennedy, pero cosas del periodo, del contexto, que ayudarían a entender mejor lo que ocurrió con el magnicidio de Dallas. Quiero saludar que está Aldo Calero con nosotros desde Michigan y a la amiga Jacobita, que siempre nos gusta mucho cuando ella está por aquí. Bueno, y lo último que ya, porque no quiero extenderme mucho antes de presentar la entrevista, es que quiero ofrecer disculpas porque para hacerlo en español, la entrevista fue en inglés, pero la traduje al español en subtítulos a través de la inteligencia, usando programas de inteligencia artificial, y usted lo que va a ver es una traducción literal. Para mí era muy trabajoso ir a una traducción manual de los subtítulos, y por eso la calidad de la traducción es muy cuestionable. Por poner un ejemplo que a mí me dio gracia, fue que encontré que cuando hablaba del director Oliver Stone, la traducción es tan literal que traduce director Oliver Piedra. Obviamente, si usted está escuchando y sabe que se está hablando del director Oliver Stone, usted no se va a creer que hay un director de cine que se llama Oliver Piedra y que ha hecho una traducción y que ha hecho una película sobre Kennedy. Por lo cual quiero alertarles y disculparles. También yo soy una persona que entiendo muy bien el inglés, escribo muy bien en inglés. Yo creo que yo hablo el inglés fluidamente, porque lo hago, llevo bastantes años en los Estados Unidos, pero yo sigo teniendo un acento fuerte. Y a veces, precisamente por eso, sobre todo cuando estoy ante cámara, me pongo un poquitico más nervioso. Ya en la clase estoy mucho más conforme. en el contexto de un aula, pero eso a veces me limita cuando estoy sobre todo haciendo un programa. A veces estaba en la televisión y tenía que pensar mucho más lo que estaba diciendo, pero en este caso no era yo el entrevistado, sino el que estaba entrevistando. Y me gusta en eso ser flexible, porque la propia técnica de la entrevista indica que usted tiene que ser flexible ante las respuestas que da el entrevistado. Bueno, yo lo voy a dejar ahí. Tengo que agradecer a Aldo Calero, que ya nos ha hecho un aporte al canal. Siempre mejor cuando se hace por Cele, pero le agradezco mucho que lo haga por aquí. Y vamos a empezar entonces a ver esta entrevista a Peter Kornbluh, el senior analyst o analista mayor del archivo de los archivos de seguridad nacional y uno de los expertos de primer nivel en relaciones Cuba-Estados Unidos, relaciones Estados Unidos-Chile y en concreto en este periodo, la crisis de octubre, la invasión de Bahía de Cochinos y otros temas. Así que vamos allá y lo vamos. Hola amigos, hola amigas, estamos en una nueva edición de nuestro programa Conversaciones Americanas, pero esta vez vamos a hacerlo en inglés para facilitar la conversación con el amigo Peter Kornbluh. Yo lo voy a presentar ahora en español, pero también ya después estaremos en inglés. Peter Kornbluh es alguien al que los latinoamericanos, los cubanos, los latinos en los Estados Unidos, los norteamericanos en general, debemos agradecerle que ha jugado un papel muy importante en la declasificación de importantes documentos sobre las relaciones entre Estados Unidos y América Latina. Como cubano, le agradezco en especial, y como cubano y estadounidense, las dos cosas, mis dos amores, mis dos países, le agradezco en especial ser coautor de un libro excepcional, el libro Back Channel to Cuba o Diplomacia Encubierta con Cuba, que hace una historia imprescindible para entender los intentos de negociación entre Cuba y Estados Unidos desde las administraciones del presidente Eisenhower hasta la administración del presidente Barack Obama. Creo que es un libro excepcional, siempre recomendado, hemos hablado en el programa antes, y también quiero resaltar otra área en la cual Peter ha sido un gran contribuyente, y es en la política de Estados Unidos hacia Chile, otra de las áreas que más nos ha interesado, y Peter ha publicado varios libros sobre estos temas. Él es el analista senior y director de los proyectos documentales de Chile y Cuba en los archivos de seguridad nacional y ha trabajado en estas tareas desde 1986. Ha enseñado como profesor adjunto en la Escuela de Asuntos Públicos Internacionales de la Universidad de Columbia y también tiene relevancia en la revelación de importantes documentos en torno al escándalo Irán-Contras. Voy ahora a compartir con ustedes algunos de los libros que Peter ha publicado. Se los pongo en un momentico y ya estamos empezando. Espérense aquí. Aquí tenemos esta es su página que se puede encontrar en los Archivos Nacionales de Seguridad y usted puede ver aquí importantes libros que él tiene como Pinochet desclasificado, por ejemplo, donde está que habla de los archivos secretos de Estados Unidos sobre Chile. También está juega un papel importante en la desclasificación de los documentos sobre el informe secreto de la CIA sobre la invasión de Bahía de Cochinos y muchas otras cosas más. Bueno, ahora voy a transformar la presentación en inglés. Peter Kornbluh is Senior Analyst of the National Security Archives. He has been a professor at Columbia University and he's also major authors of articles in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, in Los Angeles Times, in a regular columnist at The Nation. And I think it's someone that any program like Conversaciones Americanas welcome, because it's a luxury, a privilege to have Peter Kornbluh with us to discuss the most recent events of declassification of documents around the assassination of President Kennedy and the implementation by the Trump administration of the so-called JFK Act. The act has a longest name, but this basically represents what we are saying. Peter, welcome to the program. What a privilege to have you here.
Bueno, gracias, Arturo. Quiero saludar a toda la audiencia de ustedes, pedir disculpas de hablar en inglés, pero es mucho más fácil describir estos documentos secretos de la CIA sobre Cuba y Chile, etcétera, y la historia del asesinato de presidente Kennedy en inglés. Pues, so we'll just talk in English if we can.
Yeah, and I know if at any time you want to say something in Spanish, our audience tend to be bilingual, but it's okay on that. So, Peter, the first thing that I want to ask you is why this massive declassification at this moment? What are the fundamental issues that explain two things: this massive declassification and also the very interesting hearing in Congress that took place under Chairman Luna, Ana Paula Luna from Florida, Republican, and there was a hearing about the issue of the assassination of President Kennedy. What explained this particular critical juncture?
Well, there's two different issues here. One is that we've come to the final moments of a law, a very famous law and a very important law called the Kennedy Assassination Records Act that was passed by Congress in 1992, many, many, many years ago. And this law was the result of public outrage in the United States over the fact that thousands, tens of thousands, millions of pages of documents were still secret on the Kennedy assassination. The outrage was spurred by a movie called JFK, which starred Kevin Costner, the same Kevin Costner who just went to Cuba just a few weeks ago. And it was a movie about a conspiracy theory that played out in New Orleans in the mid-1960s when a prosecutor there named Jim Garrison decided to prosecute a local businessman who was gay for killing Kennedy. And then all of the conspiracy theorists came to New Orleans and talked in Garrison's ear and said to him, it was the CIA and the FBI. Even the KGB started passing disinformation to him about the CIA did it, the FBI did it. And he became this kind of focal point for conspiracy theories. And so Oliver Stone, the Hollywood director, made a movie about him called JFK, and about this idea that the CIA and the FBI had done this and that it was all being covered up because the documents hadn't been released. And the response of the public was so forceful, the thousands of calls to Congress, that the senators and congressmen in the United States in the early 90s said, we have to let all of the documents out that have anything to do, even tangentially, even marginally, with the Kennedy assassination, so that people see the truth and all these conspiracy theories can be laid to rest. And it has taken until now to get all the documents completely declassified. I won't go through that whole history, but the irony is that Oliver Stone started this process with a conspiratorial and frankly completely false premise of a movie, and now he's at the other end of it testifying before Congress in Washington, still promoting conspiracy theories, the same conspiracy theories, even though now that we have all of the documents, cleanly, openly, fully declassified. None of them advance any theory other than that Oswald himself killed President Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas.
Very interesting what you say, because I see, Peter, that based on your article in The Nation and what you just said, it's not clear for you that the movie was on the right track to explain what happened in Dallas. At the same time, your article in The Nation had a big lead that say, "Thank you, Oliver Stone." So can you explain a little more about that?
Sí, por supuesto. You know, the movie was the movie portrayed and magnified one of the worst and unsubstantiated and cruel, if you conspiracy theories that ever took place. I mean, Jim Garrison was a prosecutor in New Orleans. He investigated people who were completely innocent, had nothing to do with this crime. One of them committed suicide, and the other one was acquitted in less than an hour because there was zero evidence against him. It was all blown up. And even at the trial, Garrison had to admit that there wasn't really any evidence, but he asked the jury anyway to convict this one local businessman whose only crime seems to be that he was gay. So, you know, it was a horrible situation. Now it became the most famous movie on the Kennedy assassination that Hollywood made back in the early 90s. But the movie itself was powerful enough. And at the very end of it, a scroll came up on the screen saying that 5 million pages of documents were still secret, including all the investigative reports of the Warren Commission and a House committee that had been created afterwards to investigate this, and the Church Committee documents that Senator Frank Church investigated about the CIA and spying and et cetera. So, you know, the movie itself gained so much attention and generated so much outrage that we do have Oliver Stone to thank for the law that was passed, even if the movie itself was complete fiction.
Peter, let me ask you a question here. Is there any role in the fact that the nephew of President Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is part of the administration on this decision of declassifying and calling these hearings? Because I have read and I have heard about this, but I'm not clear how his position. Did he bargain or negotiate something like that as part of joining the Republican candidacy in 2024?
Let me say that the answer to that is partially yes. Robert Kennedy Jr. Is a conspiracy theorist himself. He has blamed the CIA for killing his uncle, John Kennedy. He believes that more than one person shot his father, Robert Kennedy, in California, 1968. And he had pressed Trump to take the final step under this law that was passed in 1992 to force the CIA and the FBI to fully declassify all of these documents. And Trump not only ordered the declassification on the president's assassination, but he also ordered all the papers on Robert Kennedy's assassination to be processed and released also. So at some point, months from now, we'll see documents there, but they're going to prove that Sirhan killed Senator Kennedy, and that's it. So part of it was that Robert Kennedy is in the administration, Robert Kennedy Jr., but there's more than that. For President Trump, who wants to kind of show his supporters that there is a deep state, nothing calls attention to that more than, you know, conspiracy theories about who killed John F. Kennedy and blaming the CIA and the FBI for doing it. And certainly the release of these documents, which I have to tell you, it's not that new documents have been released. It's just that documents that have been previously released, like 98%, now the 2% that was redacted, that was censored, which turns out to be the names of CIA and FBI informants and agents that you've seen, the places where the CIA was operating, the methods that they used to spy on countries like Cuba and Chile, or to try and roll back, the Cuban Revolution, assassinate Fidel Castro, overthrow Chetty Jagan in British Guiana, undermine the Allende government in Chile. All those things, those final little details, names, places, methods, technologies, amount of money spent, all that now has been released. So you can read the entire document. And so now that that is out, obviously it's getting a lot of attention. People are reading these documents for the first time. There's tens of thousands of them. And you and I are talking, and everybody's thinking about something that's quite historic. Está en el pasado todo esto, ¿no? En los años 60. But it seems to be important today. So for Trump, President Trump, he wants to call attention to the so-called deep state. This is one way to do that. And the other thing, which I think is extremely important, is President Trump wants to cast himself, represent himself as the transparency president, even while he's going around closing down websites, shuttering Freedom of Information Act offices, restraining information and our right to know in various ways. But with the amount of press attention to releasing these documents, he can argue that, as his supporters did during the hearing, that he's the most transparent president who has ever lived.
Yeah, that was very clear in the hearings, because particularly, not so much of Chairman Luna, but particularly the group of Republicans that come by the end of the hearings, they were trying to push the narrative that the president was doing that as an issue of embracing transparency. And also many of them try to establish a connection between the deep state hostility to President Trump and the assassination of President Kennedy, to the point that even there was a specific question about the attempt of assassination against President Trump and what happened in Dallas in 1963. You mentioned the issue of Oswald as the lone shooter, but there was an interesting thing that I would like to hear, based on your expertise, is that Jefferson Morley mentioned that there has been information about Oswald that James Angleton, the director of counterespionage of the CIA, used to have, and according to Morley, this has been hidden from the Warren Commission and then from the public at large. And also he mentioned the role of George Ioannidis, that was the director of psychological operations. I assume that is the director of psychological operations against Cuba at this time from the EM wave. But I would like to hear your views about that. If there were, he even said that 3 policemen were hiding information from the prosecution and from the jury. So he claimed that there are more about Oswald of what we can see.
Well, I don't want to debate conspiracy theories.
Okay.
That is what we call in English a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Un hueco de conejo, no? I mean,
in Spanish we use more like a nido de serpientes. It's like a nest of serpents.
Bueno.
Snakes.
Snakes, yes, serpientes. So, irregardless of what was said at the hearing, none of it proves anything or casts any doubt on the official history of the assassination. There is, little anomalies and questions that conspiracy theorists focus on, but then they don't remind you that there is a huge amount of evidence on the other side that shows what happened. That Oswald was there in that building, that people saw him, that he bought the rifle that fired the bullets that shot President Kennedy, that he himself then shot a policeman just a few minutes later and was captured, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's irrelevant. And in truth, the issue here is the historic importance, la importancia tan importante de esos documentos, no tiene que ver con el asesinato del presidente, tiene que ver con la historia de operaciones encubiertas de la CIA y el FBI alrededor del mundo. And that is what really these documents and this collection of documents give us. There was, under the Kennedy Assassination Records Act law, there was a commission set up in 1992 and given $5 million to spend basically 5 years overseeing the centralization of all sorts of different kinds of documents relating to Kennedy, but relating in a very broad way. For example, since Oswald had gone to Mexico and visited the Cuban embassy, trying to get a visa to go to Cuba, and the CIA was spying on the Cuban embassy, then everything the CIA was doing in Mexico became a Kennedy assassination-related document. So now we have the entire history of the CIA spy operations in Mexico City, which is unbelievable, increíble, realmente. And because Cuba figured in the conspiracy theories, both on the right-wing side, which accused Fidel of killing John F. Kennedy, and on the left-wing side, which accused the CIA of killing Kennedy because Kennedy hadn't supported the CIA at the Bay of Pigs, because Kennedy was involved in a secret effort at rapprochement with Fidel Castro in November of 1963. All of that became arguments to release as much as possible on the CIA operations in Cuba, against Cuba, and also all the relations with the exile community, which, according to some conspiracy theorists, worked with the CIA to kill President Kennedy. So in the end, the conspiracy theories have fueled our ability to get the full access to a history that doesn't have anything to do with the actual assassination itself, but has everything to do with, an incredible dark history, which, you know pretty well yourself, and some of your followers and your audience does as well, of what went on around the world in the early 1960s and the role that covert operations by the United States played events.
Well, as part of the education that we do through this program, I'm going to offer to the members of the program, I'm going to share with you an article by Peter Kornbluh where he described quite well these two lines of arguments of conspiracy, and he published that in this very important called Cigar Aficionado. It's something that Peter is admirable because he published very, very good articles about very important things in language that is very easy to understand, and you can even read smoking a good cigar in the beach. And he published this article in Cigar Aficionado. Please remind me, Peter, when you published this article? Because it's an article of the 2000s, early 2000s, no?
It was 2000. It was 2012. 2013 went on the 50th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's assassination, and my effort to pay tribute to the 50th anniversary was to write a story about how Cuba, which all Cigar Aficionado's readers is very interested in because of cigars, how Cuba figured into the conspiracy theories on both the left and the right. So, Arturo, I want to remind you and your listeners, on the day, at the moment that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas.
I was planning to go there. The article of Peter began by saying that at the moment when Kennedy was killed in Dallas, there was a meeting in Paris between AMLAC, is a name for Rolando Cubela Secades, a commander of the Directorio Revolucionario 13 de Marzo, and also a very important figure in the early years of the revolution. And he has a meeting with his case officer or with an officer of the CIA, and they were talking about an attempt on Fidel Castro's life. And also it's very important because the article of Peter has, it's not only two things, it's what is happening in Dallas, what is happening in Paris, but also what is happening in Varadero Beach. And it's the fact that at the same moment that the CIA officer was meeting Cubela AMLAC in Paris, and Lee Harvey Oswald or whoever was shooting, in addition, if that was the case, the conspiracy theories were right or wrong. According to Peter, he's not a fan of these theories. And at the same time, President Fidel Castro was, at that time, Prime Minister, was talking to John Daniel, who has brought a very important message of reconciliation from President Kennedy to Prime Minister Fidel Castro. This is very well explained in the book that Kornbluh has co-written with another great professor of U.S. Latin American relations, Bill Leogrand. So please continue, Peter. Sorry that I interrupt you, but I think that the third meeting is also important to see the complexity of this. Varadero must be there together with Paris and Dallas.
Well, in Varadero, this French journalist, Jean Daniel, who had met with Kennedy just weeks before he came to Cuba and was bringing a message from Kennedy to Fidel, basically, which is, you know, we could have peaceful coexistence if you want to. And they're literally discussing this message when an aide to Fidel comes in and says, turn on the radio, the president of the United States has been shot. And the very first thing Fidel says to Jean Daniel is, they're going to say we did it. And that was the first conspiracy theory, blaming the Cubans, Fidel Castro, for assassinating President Kennedy before President Kennedy could assassinate him, which of course was a program that the CIA was obviously trying to do. It wasn't just that a CIA agent was talking to AMLAC, to Cubela in Paris. He was trying to give him a hypodermic poison pen, a pen that was in fact a needle, had a needle in it that he would somehow get close enough to Fidel and prick him and poison him, and Fidel would die. And this is, you know, that was a legendary scene. Of course, Cubela's response was, that was a suicide mission, give me a sniper rifle. and eventually they did give him a sniper rifle. You know, the very first conspiracy theory essentially was pointing the fingers at Fidel Castro for somehow engineering this assassination. And there's a bunch of documents in this release, this final release, that show that the CIA actually investigated very meticulously for years what, as one document's called, what Fidel might have known. In other words, what Fidel would have known about the assassination plots against him, and whether those spurred him to take countermeasures to kill the president of the United States. And all those investigations concluded that Fidel wouldn't have known anything and that the Cubans were not involved.
So let's talk now about some of the documents that has been declassified. As you just mentioned, and let's talk about one country that is very relevant for U.S. Latin American relations, Mexico. Just 1 second. It's Mexico. It's clear that the deepness, the type of contact between the CIA and the president of Mexico was quite close. So what can you say about that?
The president of Mexico, López Mateos,
Rodolfo López Mateo
was a CIA collaborator. We don't know if he was a paid collaborator or not, but he was an obvious collaborator. He allowed the CIA to use his actual office, the office of the president of Mexico, to install a whole listening system, an espionage, telephone tap, eavesdropping system. It was put in the president's office so that the CIA would not have to work with the Mexican intelligence service, which they believed was not professional enough and might be infiltrated by Cubans and Russians and others. And so they limited the amount of people who knew about this spying operation basically to the very top, the president of Mexico. And he let them install this whole system in which they could intercept all the phone calls from the Soviet embassy, from the Cuban embassy. I mean, you know, there are tapes out there of Cuban diplomats in Mexico City calling back to Havana after John F. Kennedy was shot, and basically saying pretty nasty things. I have to say, unfortunately.
I was quite surprised. I was, well, let's say not surprised, but the level of how can we say, resentment about the Cuban Revolution in a president that's supposed to be the heir of a revolutionary tradition is quite surprising. But he said that you can count on me. I hate something like that. That I will favor with all my strength everything I can do to get rid of Castro. He was too.
Yes, and I don't know if your audience is aware that even though publicly Mexico stood up very publicly for Cuba and pressed the United States publicly and internationally to leave Cuba alone, at the time in the early 60s, in the mid 60s, the Mexican government decided to allow the CIA to place an agent in the Mexican embassy in Havana to spy on the Cubans. And that was revealed towards the end of the 1960s. That for
exactly.
a number of years, the CIA had a Mexican-American supposedly diplomat who was really a CIA officer working out of the Mexican embassy in Havana. But, you know, the CIA had other agents and other embassies, so Mexico wasn't alone. But Mexico was alone as one of the only countries that refused to join the OAS boycott of Cuba in 1964 and spoke publicly against U.S. policy.
It's quite a complex relationship. We recommend the audience. The National Security Archives has declassified also important documents about the later issue of the Tlatelolco massacre. And it's also a good source of documents about Mexican track. There is also this interesting article by Renata Keller that is about message to Cuba, and it was published, I think it's in international organization, or you can look for Renata Keller, message to Cuba, to our audience. There is an interesting dynamic there that need to be explored. It's fascinating.
She wrote a whole very comprehensive article in a journal about Mexico's true foreign policy towards Cuba.
Yeah. So let's talk then about some of the documents that has been declassified. And let's begin by Cuba, because I don't want that the time goes, but I also would like to ask you about Chile, in which you are not second of anyone as scholars of the coup, the U.S. policy toward Allende, and it's something that is very close to my heart, because this program has tried to highlight the possibility of a Latin American democratic left whose path was frequently and many times closed, despite of its adherence its commitment to liberal democratic rules. Let's remember that President Allende, no one can claim that he was trying to do a revolution by any other means than respecting the Chilean constitution. But that's why, although we might take a little time, or you might have to come another time, Chile is an example that for the editorial line of this program, basically my editorial line, it's important to take your brain and get what you need to say about that. But about Cuba, what do we know? What do we know from these documents?
Bueno, quiero decir que mis países de estudiar son Cuba y Chile. Y hay una magnitud de documentos desclasificados ahora sobre los dos países y historias tan increíbles también de conocer. What about Cuba? I mean, everything about Cuba. The documents are filled with details about covert operations against Cuba. We are about to post and publish a number of very high-level reports to the White House that took place in the early 1960s by CIA representatives, explaining what they were doing around the world in terms of covert operations, but particularly what they were doing in Cuba, which of course was a central focus of CIA covert operations. Just to give you a sense of where Cuba stood in the kind of priorities of the United States in the early 1960s. In 1961, the budget of the CIA was in Latin America was about, I don't know, $55 million, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but in those days, that was an astronomical amount. More than 47 million of that went to Cuba. Over the first 4 years, 1960 through 1964, the CIA spent over $100 million on covert operations against Cuba, in comparison to maybe $14–15 million throughout the rest of all of Latin America. We had the statistics that were given to the White House on CIA's presence in Cuba. They had more than 180 agents and assets on the island. That's not counting more than 550 personnel that were working in Miami and Washington on Cuba for the CIA. So, you know, Cuba was a top priority. We are learning the names of agents. We're learning the names of other countries that supported CIA operations to roll back the Cuban Revolution. There's a list in one document of 15 countries that is secretly collaborating with the CIA to undermine the Cuban Revolution and spy on the Castro government. And they're countries that would surprise you. You know, Mexico's included, Italy, Germany, England, and, you know, a dozen others. So, you know, this is super interesting. You know, it's history. Este es el pasado, pero al mismo tiempo tiene una relevancia para hoy día, donde todavía tenemos el conflicto y las relaciones horribles entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos. So, you know,
by the way, I want to highlight for the audience also that in late 2024, I'm not sure if it was after the election, but Foreign Policy published an article by Peter Kornbluh and Bill Leogrand, in which the 10 years of the relationship after December 17, 2014 were balanced. There was an assessment of the derailment of the detente process that is one of the greatest tragedies of, I think, between the two countries. Yes, Peter, sorry if I interrupt you, but I wanted to use my hat of professor.
I think that's an important article. Bill Leogrand and I wrote about the 10th anniversary of the Obama-Raul Castro breakthrough in relations, which started with such promise and such an impact on Cuban society and on average Cubans' daily life, and seemed to indicate that we were going to have finally normalized relations. And then this was all washed away by President Trump during his first term, and with pretty harsh, and dire consequences for the Cuban people, which are still obvious today as Cuba's economy is suffering and the Cuban people are suffering.
I must say, to be non-partisan, and I don't want to move the interview in this direction, that President Biden didn't do a lot either during his 4 years in office, and he was elected different from Trump. He was elected with a promise of not the same, but a quasi-return to a policy of exploring opportunities for the United States in a Cuba in transition. But he basically endorsed, in most of the time, the policy against Cuba as a threat to the United States that we both know that is the wrong diagnostic about Cuba, the wrong image.
Well, I'm not going to argue with you at all on that point, but only to say that when Biden had become president, we had 4 more years under Trump of normalized commercial and cultural and political relations between our countries, I believe we would still have that normalized situation today. But that's not what Biden inherited. So anyway,
so let me go to some of the documents, because I would like to ask you something specific. By the way, I am typically, and I recommend to people that are interested in this, go to the National Security Archives, where Peter is the senior analyst, because they are revealing, they are not declassifying, they are uploading digital versions of documents almost every week now with this issue of the JFK Act. Let's begin by some of the things that has to do with the situation of the CIA in Cuba at the moment when the revolution triumphed. I am a fan of seeing things that are of a structural nature. For instance, it's to me clear that McCarthyism played a role, the legacy of McCarthyism from the mid-50s to 1959 played a role in some of the attitudes toward Cuban nationalism early on in the Cuban Revolution. But now there is this addition that the relationship, not only with Cuba, but even with France, was framed by a lot of espionage, covert operations. This was such an important feature of American mechanism of foreign policy that I wonder how much this influenced American attitude toward Cuba early in 1959. So now we know a lot about, as you said, the number of agents, the number of diplomats that in reality were not diplomats. What can you tell us about that? What do we know now from documents such as the historical staff Western Hemisphere Division 1946-1965 that was revealed and now is declassified?
Well, that is an important document. We have posted other documents that are equally descriptive. There are documents that literally tell you almost point by point how the CIA went about sabotaging an entire boatload of sugar that was being shipped from Cuba to Odessa in the Soviet Union. Pretty interesting to see how the CIA does these things. All the discussions about assassinating.
Can you tell us some features of or some elements of how did they do it?
So, one of the things that the CIA does, and one of these documents that we obtained on how many CIA assets and agents there were in Cuba, which we're going to publish in just a few days, points out that there were over 47 assets and agents spying on Cuban shipping. And that meant that not only did they have agents among the dock workers in Cuba, outside of Havana or wherever, but they also had agents at various other ports around the world where Cuban ships or Soviet ships stopped. And these agents would inform the CIA when a Cuban ship was coming and what supposedly it was carrying. And in one case, the CIA got a message from an agent in Puerto Rico that a specific ship that was loaded with Cuban sugar had broken down and was going to be coming into the Puerto Rican port for repairs, and that the cargo would have to be unloaded so that those repairs could be made. And this created a big opportunity. The CIA knew that Cuban sugar was going to be taken out of the boat. It was going to be stored in a specific warehouse. They took a specific contaminant that was supposedly odorless, and they infected. They had an agent go into the warehouse and kind of inject this poison, if you will. It wasn't to kill people; it was to make the sugar taste terrible. Right, and then the idea, and then they contaminated about 80 bags of a huge shipload. But their argument was that all that sugar would be mixed together when it got to Odessa. It would be brought to a factory. It would all be mixed together and processed for use in coffee and use in cakes and et cetera. And everything that it was used in the taste would be destroyed. And so the Russian people, the Soviet people, would no longer want to use Cuban sugar. And this would create a big breach in the relationship between the Soviet Union and Cuba. So, but just the stages of this specific covert operation are so intriguing to learn about. We read about discussions of the United States using, biological chemicals in warfare to contaminate Cuban crops. We certainly learned about infiltration, the recruitment of Cuban officials and diplomats around the world, et cetera, et cetera. So there's much to learn. You literally are brought into the universe. You're now a fly on the wall. Podemos estar en el salón cuando están decidiendo, planeando, haciendo sus planes para todo este trabajo contra Cuba, contra Chile, contra Cherry Jagan and British Guiana, contra toda la izquierda en el mundo.
Yeah, I remember the phrase of Hans Morgenthau, one of the founders of the discipline of international relations, that he emphasized the role of the historians for international relations, and he said that archives allow us to look at the policymaker at work over his shoulder. He said that you can go look over his shoulder what he is doing, and it's very interesting. I think that the work that you do, it provides flesh to the bones of a lot of international relations theory, but we need to put this with some evidences. And it's clear that the role of the things that we don't see in politics is very relevant. This document, for instance, say this, that it's really, it showed the level of obsession with Cuba when it said that 47% of all the traffic of messages between the CIA station in Mexico and Langley was about Cuba. With such a big country like Mexico is, and the relevance for Central America, for the relationship with the United States, almost 50% of all the traffic has the topic of Cuba in the period between 59 and 65. Peter, let me ask you about another of these documents. There is a document, I am having trouble now to find it because I have a lot of the documents here, but there is a document, I think, that is by Walter Elder, or Eder, no?
Elder,
And
yes.
he wrote about the things that has not been presented to the Warren Commission, and one of them make a reference to a plan to contaminate also the rice crop in Cuba and Vietnam. What do we know about that?
I mean, we know what he wrote, but we don't have the operational documents for those specific plans. We don't even know for sure that they went forward. We do have what are known as the minutes, the sumarios, of the meetings of the Grupo Especial, the special group, which was the kind of interagency top national security officials who would meet once a week, once every 2 weeks, and approve CIA proposals for covert operations. And we have those memoranda of conversations. It allows us to go right in the room and be there listening while these national security officials and very high-level CIA officers, the Deputy Director of Plans, Richard Helms, the CIA Director, John McCone, are discussing specific operations just like that, contaminating Cuba's agricultural fields, spraying some type of gas on the crops. And you know, it's not all, yes, let's do this. It's, geez, if we get caught doing that, it's really going to be a problem. So if we do that, it has to be very carefully done so that our hands don't show, you know, that que no nos toca esto.
Plausible deniability. I think.
Yes, plausible denial. That's exactly right. And so you have to use a type of chemical that's kind of natural to Cuba. You have to make sure that it's delivered in a way that could plausibly happen there on the island as opposed to being brought from abroad. And, you know, these are the types of discussions that took place, and they're fascinating. Much of this we knew before, but interestingly enough, just because of the nature of this declassification of documents, what I call the final secrets, los secretos finales, en estos documentos, ya tenemos la posibilidad de enfocar nuestra atención histórico a todos estos documentos. And it's coming at a very important time in U.S. history and world history to remember that, you know, operations that take place in the dark are very sinister and not in the best interest of the American public or the world community.
One area that I am really interested is in the issue of how much the CIA reflected in its reports and analysis about the disputes that were taking place inside the revolutionary government in Cuba, in where there were different trends, different tendencies. And even when you read, for instance, the memoir of Rufo Lopez Fresquet, you see that he is basically, he wants to preserve Cuba within the Western Hemisphere, US leadership type, but at the same time, he is critical of how the United States is pushing is closing, not is pushing, but is closing the space for moderates within the Cuban revolutionary government by some of the policies. And it's very interesting that a document that the National Security Archives show in the past, probably you were the one that were involved in that, is the conversation in 1959, I think it's November 1959, between I think it's the British ambassador and Christian Herter, in which basically they say, no, that's what we want. We want to push him being Castro, to do things that show him in an alliance with the communists in a way that we can go after him in a more open way.
Yes, well, we know very well that early on after the revolution, when the United States had decided it wanted to overthrow Fidel, and pressure was building from the United States, Fidel, went to the British and said, we need planes and we want to buy military planes. And secretly, the CIA director, Allen Dulles, went to the British and said, don't sell Fidel those planes, because if you don't sell them to him, he'll have to buy them from Czechoslovakia or a country in the Soviet bloc, and we'll be able to accuse him of being a communist and being an ally of the Soviet Union. So there was certainly an effort to create that impression of Fidel and cut him off from the West, so that the United States would have more arguments for its plans to overthrow him.
And this is more an opinion that comes from the Eisenhower administration. But thinking about what was Kennedy thinking, or Kennedy's analysis that explained the mission of Jean Daniel, it's important to see up to what point a reorganization of the government planned by Kennedy could have also an impact on the relationship with Cuba. So I would like that you address the issue of the Schlesinger memo.
One of the very first document that everybody looked for when all these 80,000 pages were finally released unredacted a couple of weeks ago was a document written by a top White House aide who became very famous, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. I personally brought him to Havana twice to sit around the conference table in the Palacio de Convenciones and talk to Fidel Castro directly about this history. And when he was a White House aide, after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy said to him, I don't know what we should do about the CIA. I think we need to do something about the CIA. And I'd like you to explore what our options are. And actually, Schlesinger wrote two very long memos to President Kennedy. One was a memo about how the British organized their intelligence service and how the British Foreign Ministry basically has control over British covert operations around the world, so that covert operations fit with the foreign policy of the British government. And then he wrote another long memo, which is the one that everybody looked for when these documents were declassified. The memo is 15 pages long. We've had it for over 20 years declassified, except for a page and a half had been completely blacked out. And this page and a half turns out to contain information about how the CIA used U.S. embassies abroad for cover for its agents, and the fact that basically half of the diplomats around the world that were supposedly U.S. diplomats were in fact CIA agents undercover, working in the embassy in Paris. And the embassy in Paris, the U.S. embassy in Paris, 123 supposed diplomats were actually covert intelligence officers and operatives. In Chile, 11 of the 13 political officers in the early 1960s were actually CIA agents working inside the embassy, and this around the world. And so that section was finally declassified, and we learned kind of the almost octopus-like tentacles of the CIA presence in every capital and every U.S. embassy in so many countries. But what was important about the document was that it was Schlesinger's effort to convince the president that the CIA should be basically closed and reconfigured. Its covert operations should be given to the Pentagon. Its intelligence operations should be shared with the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and that the CIA basically should cease to exist and be recreated. And this was because of how angry John F. Kennedy was after the failure of the Bay of Pigs. He felt that CIA officers had deceived him about the likelihood of success, He felt that this was a huge blow to U.S. prestige, to him personally, and to U.S. foreign policy around the world. And he didn't want this to happen again. And he briefly entertained the idea that the CIA could be reconstructed. In the end, he did not pursue that. He did not take all of Schlesinger's advice. He did fire the director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, and he did fire the deputy director for covert operations, Richard Bissell. He also put his brother, Robert Kennedy, who was the attorney general, in charge of the special group Augmented, which was the most elite of the interagency officials who decided on covert operations, specifically on Cuba. And under Robert Kennedy's directorship, the special group Augmented came up with the whole Operation Mongoose plan to once again try and overthrow Fidel Castro and roll back the Cuban Revolution. So Kennedy did not really change, John F. Kennedy did not really change his position on covert operations. He didn't really change the institution of the CIA. He continued with its most...
I'm persuaded by your references. I think I was thinking on the topic is that the document. I was reading the document, and I thought that when people talk about Kennedy's changing views by the end or by the moment when he's killed, it's very interesting how the operation of Bay of Pigs was a kind of loose canyon that if you see people on the more diplomatic side, the memo of Schlesinger's memo about not sending the invasion, Dean Rusk worried about the impact of the invasion on the policy towards Latin America, the position of Adlai Stevenson, Bill Atwood. I saw that if the CIA was more just part and not its own acting on its own, perhaps something like a less aggressive policy based on an idea of successful covert operation could have moderate the policy of hitting Cuba without any gloves. That's the way I saw it. But I think that probably, or I would say you probably are right on that more than what I have thought about. In any case, I was quite persuaded that you cannot have an intelligence service based so much on covert operations, acting on its own with a level of disconnection from the State Department that is critical. Let's remember that Larry Eagleburger wrote that when the invasion of Bay of Pigs was launched, Larry Eagleburger was an officer at the State Department, and he wrote that most likely the invasion will be defeated. Am I right on that or not?
I don't remember that specific document. It is true, your point that that when one reads these Schlesinger memos, and he argues that there was nobody to kind of oppose the Bay of Pigs invasion plan, that wasn't quite true. There were a number of people, including him, who stood up and said this is a bad idea. But they were overruled
Yes.
because Kennedy wanted to do this, and because the CIA presented all these false arguments about how it would be successful.
And the so-called disposal problem. That was
Yes,
also...
that's a very famous argument that was given by the director of Central Intelligence, Allen Dulles, to the president, which was, if we don't send these 1,000 exiles that we've trained to invade Cuba, if we don't actually invade Cuba, what's going to happen with them? You know, are they all going to go back to Miami and basically say, El presidente no tiene cajones?
Yes.
And that's going to be a problem for you, basically. And that was one of the arguments that propelled Kennedy to go forward with this cockamamie.
Well, Peter, let me show now a video about what Fidel Castro said on November 23. I want to show you, I know that you know very well what he said, but let's show it to the audience and we will know about this. And I want to ask you how much he was right about the things that he was saying just 24 hours after the magnicide, the assassination in Dallas. By the way, this is from the Center Fidel Castro in Cuba that they upload this video recently.
El gobierno de los Estados Unidos, tanto la administración anterior de Eisenhower como la administración de Kennedy, no practicó una política precisamente amistosa hacia nosotros. La política de ambas administraciones se caracterizaron por su espíritu agresivo, hostil e implacable hacia nuestro país. Hemos sido víctimas de una hostilidad constante por parte de los Estados Unidos. Y entre los gobernantes y los hombres dirigentes de Estados Unidos, le cabía a Kennedy una importante responsabilidad en esos hechos. Y sin embargo, la noticia del asesinato del presidente de los Estados Unidos es una noticia grave y mala. Esto debemos analizarlo bien para comprenderlo, sobre todo analizarlo serenamente, desapasionadamente, que es como los revolucionarios debemos analizar estas cosas. Algunos se preguntarán ¿cómo precisamente los cubanos que han recibido tantas agresiones por parte de los Estados Unidos, de la propia administración de Kennedy, pueden decir que es una mala noticia? Pueden tener una actitud de este tipo frente a esa noticia. Y es que los cubanos, en primer lugar, debemos reaccionar como revolucionarios. En segundo lugar, los cubanos, como revolucionarios conscientes, no debemos confundir los sistemas con los hombres. Y tenemos que empezar por considerar que nosotros no odiamos a los hombres, odiamos los sistemas. El hecho en sí mismo puede tener repercusiones muy negativas para los intereses de nuestro país, pero no se trata de los intereses de nuestro país en este caso, sino los intereses de todo el mundo. Debemos saber poner los intereses de la humanidad por encima de los intereses de nuestro país. Nosotros podemos decir que hay elementos dentro de los Estados Unidos que defienden una política ultra reaccionaria en todos los campos, tanto en el de la política internacional como en el de la política interna. Y esos son los únicos elementos llamados a beneficiarse de los sucesos que ocurrieron ayer en los Estados Unidos. Y aún dentro de la situación de Estados Unidos, dentro de la política de Estados Unidos, que en su conjunto es indefendible, Kennedy era fuertemente atacado por los círculos más reaccionarios, por los círculos más belicosos, por los círculos más guerreristas. Y así tenemos una serie de cosas que fueron motivo de constantes críticas de esos sectores ultraderechistas. Por ejemplo, el problema de Cuba. El compromiso surgido a raíz de la crisis de octubre de no invadir a Cuba fue uno de los puntos de la política de Kennedy, que era más constantemente atacado por los sectores ultrarreaccionarios. ¿Qué hay detrás del asesinato de Kennedy? ¿Cuáles fueron los verdaderos móviles del asesinato de Kennedy? ¿Qué fuerzas, factores, circunstancias se movieron detrás de este hecho inesperado, insólito, ocurrido en el día de ayer? Todavía exactamente en estos instantes la cosa no tiene nada absolutamente clara. En estos instantes hay mucha cosa oscura y mucha cosa confusa alrededor de los hechos que dieron lugar al asesinato del presidente de los Estados Unidos. Y hay algunas otras cosas que son síntomas evidentes de todo lo que estaba diciendo anteriormente, de que las fuerzas más reaccionarias se están desbocando dentro de los Estados Unidos. Por ejemplo, el peor síntoma es el aprovechamiento que están haciendo del hecho para desatar dentro de Estados Unidos un estado de histeria antisoviética y de histeria anticubana. Es decir, que ya se están combinando para crear un cuadro en la opinión pública de los Estados Unidos, y el peor carácter que tiene es que están agitando una campaña del peor espíritu macartista, del peor espíritu anticomunista. Cuando ocurrió el asesinato del presidente Kennedy, lo que por la mente de la inmensa mayoría de las personas pasó, y con seguridad por la mente de la inmensa mayoría de los ciudadanos norteamericanos pasó, y era lógico que pasara, que el asesinato del presidente Kennedy era la obra de algunos de los elementos inconformes con su política internacional, es decir, con su política del pacto nuclear, con su política respecto a Cuba, que no la consideraban suficientemente agresiva y a la que consideraban débil, con su política en relación de los problemas civiles internos de los Estados Unidos. Preveíamos que a raíz de estos acontecimientos podía tenderse la celada de nuevo, la emboscada, el plan maquiavélico contra nuestra patria, que sobre la sangre misma de su presidente asesinado hubiera gente con suficiente falta de escrúpulo para comenzar a elaborar inmediatamente una política agresiva contra Cuba, si es que esa política agresiva no estaba anteriormente vinculada con el asesinato.
Well, Peter, was Fidel Castro right when he anticipated that there will be strong forces in America trying to blame the assassination of the president on Cuba?
Well, I think there are two issues to consider listening to Fidel. One is that he himself, within 24 hours of the assassination, is basically suggesting that there are ultra-conservative forces, ultra-reaccionarios, who might actually be responsible for this. He is in some ways laying the groundwork for arguing that the hardline political forces, the CIA, whatever, might have been involved. But one of the reasons he's doing that people don't remember and don't understand is because Fidel knew something that very few people knew, which is that Kennedy was seriously interested in pursuing a rapprochement with Cuba. Not only was Jean Daniel with Fidel at the very moment this happened, but back in New York and Washington, another intermediary between Cuba and the Kennedy administration, a journalist, an ABC News reporter named Lisa Howard, had been setting up a meeting for a high-level U.S. official with Fidel. And that was going to take place in just a few weeks. They'd been on the phone with Fidel, discussing it with him, and he knew that Kennedy was reaching out and that they were involved in secret diplomacy for better relations at the very moment that Kennedy was killed. And so his immediate suspicion, of course, was that people who did not want to see that process go forward were responsible for killing the president. I have to say, I think there's an incredible irony here, which is that Lee Harvey Oswald, who did kill the president, was, believed himself to be a big solidarity supporter of the Cuban Revolution. And I think he believed, and this is described as a theory in CIA documents about what might have motivated Oswald. It had gotten into the press in New Orleans, where Oswald was living, that the part of Operation Mongoose was an attempt to kill Fidel, and that Fidel was very angry about this. And the theory that the CIA had was that Oswald was motivated to kill the president in order to protect the Cuban Revolution from CIA assassination plots. And the irony here is, of course, is that an assassin's bullet aborted, interrupted, stopped, terminated the earliest and most significant secret effort to arrive at a modus vivendi between Washington and Havana in 1963. And that, beyond the incredible tragedy of John F. Kennedy being killed and the psychological wounds in the United States of America and around the world, the tragedy of what might have been for U.S.-Cuban relations if that had not happened still lingers with me and makes my blood boil, frankly.
Peter, something that I found interesting on this issue of those documents, and I want to go back a little to the, don't take it that I am taking a position. I'm simply representing a view that I have heard a lot in the context of Cuba, even among exiles. How much do you think, how much attention should we give to positions such as that present, such that this one that present Oswald as a kind of either not an agent, some people call him an agent of the CIA, or that present him as at least manipulated by the CIA? What evidence do we have about this? A lot of people are mentioning Antonio Veciana's testimony that he claimed that he saw David Attel Phillips meeting Oswald in Dallas. How much evidence do we have there?
None.
None.
Absolutely zero. There's
Okay.
not a single document that shows any contact, communication, payment, effort of influence of any kind. So again, the conspiracy theories, I live in the United States. They have dominated U.S. society. I have to say a lot of people have made a lot of money off of them over the years. Some of them have been pushed by KGB propaganda and disinformation. They're hurtful to the psychology and cohesion of the American public. And now they're being used to advance a political agenda in Washington, which is also extremely harmful to U.S. society. But Cuba is always going to be part of this history, whether because it had to do with Oswald's motivations or because of the conspiracy theories that Fidel was behind the assassination, or because of the conspiracy theories that The CIA killed Kennedy because Kennedy didn't support them at the Bay of Pigs, et cetera, et cetera. What we can focus on, what we can take away from this history is these declassified documents. The Kennedy files are the gift to history that keep on giving. Voy a decirlo en español. Los archivos del asesinato de Kennedy es un regalo histórico que jamás ha parado para todas estas décadas, más de 60 años. We are still learning more about U.S.-Cuban relations, U.S. involvement around the world. It's a history that remains relevant, particularly when it comes to U.S.-Cuban relations.
Peter, coming back to the topic of that was the object of Schlesinger memo, do we have any evidence that what he said was happening in many embassies, that the CIA was more relevant than the ambassador, was happening in Cuba? I'm taking. I know first of all, I want to thank you not only for taking Schlesinger to Cuba. We must say that Peter, or as people in Latin America, that we want good relations between the United States and Latin America. We must also thank you for this role that you have played organizing meetings, not only to trace history, but to think about the future of the relationship. If you want to know about how Peter is well mentioned, read the beautiful book by the great historian Doris Kearns Goodwin about her relationship with her husband, Richard Goodwin, and she mentioned one of the reasons of the visit to Cuba, a good relation as historians, but also as humans, that Peter had with Dick Goodwin and with his wife, who is a person. Sometimes you must say that Dick Goodwin is the husband of Doris Kearns Goodwin, rather than saying that Doris Kearns Goodwin is the wife of Dick Goodwin.
Well, let me say, Arturo, that I also had the honor of taking Richard Goodwin to Cuba twice, and his wife Doris Kearns Goodwin came with us to the Cuban Missile Crisis Conference. I organized the big international conferences over 20 years ago, almost 25 years ago now, first on the 40th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs, and then on the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I just want to end with a little story, if I can. During the conference on the Bay of Pigs, we brought 5 members of the Exile Brigade, of the 2506 Brigade, with us. They were courageous. They received death threats from many people in Miami, but they came. They used the opportunity of being there to look for the graves of their comrades who had been killed on the beaches of Playa Girón. They met with Fidel. They were part of the big conference. Arthur Schlesinger was there. Richard Goodwin was there. The former deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Ray Klein, was there. The administrator of Operation Mongoose, Sam Halperin, told Fidel Castro across the conference room table the story of how the CIA tried to assassinate him using an exploding seashell, an exploding conch shell. And they had to abandon this project after they couldn't figure out how to get Fidel to pick up that one shell that would be on the ocean floor that had a bomb in it. But I did get to participate in a state dinner, and there was a table. I just want to end on this concept of how history can help bring us together. We can use history to make history. And seated at this table, at this dinner for the conference, was Fidel Castro, was John F. Kennedy's sister, was Arthur Schlesinger and Richard Goodwin. And Arthur Schlesinger said to Fidel Castro, you know, how do you stay healthy? Do you take exercise? I'll always remember this. Arthur Schlesinger saying to Fidel Castro, Mr. President, do you take exercise? Do you exercise? And Fidel went into a whole response about how he took walks but really important, how he took a special vitamin pill that Cuba was manufacturing out of seaweed, and that he wanted to give Arthur a number of bottles of this seaweed vitamin to take back to the United States. And you know, we are talking today about a history of aggression. There's also a hidden history of efforts at better relations.
That is important to highlight also.
Yeah, but you know, at least because we're talking about the history of aggression, and because I know it's being talked about in Cuba as well, you know, I'm hoping that we can do what we did with the Bay of Pigs Conference, which of course was the most open and aggressive of the U.S. attacks on Cuba, and try and use this history to build a better future. And that's what the real value of these JFK documents are. That is the ultimate value of this history, to remember a very dark past and to work towards a much brighter future. And with that, I would love to say thank you to you and your audience for having me on your show.
Well, we really appreciate, Peter, that you have come to our program, Conversaciones Americanas, and we must say that there are other topics that we would like to talk with you about Chile.
Voy a regresar.
That you feel that this is your house. I'm sure that our audience appreciate very much the effort that you have taken for almost an hour and a half to come and talk with us about this. Knowing about this history can, as Peter said, open doors, open our eyes for thinking better as Americans, as Cubans, as Mexicans, as Latin Americans, as Canadians, because there are also information about Canada and how it's important to look at the world in which we are living as neighbors that we like it or not, we will have to live together. And Peter, thank you.
Así es, Arturo. Gracias por todo.
Nos vemos entonces.
Nos
Chao.
vemos. Nos vemos. Chao, chao.
Chao.